Christmas morning, 1858. Somewhere in the tobacco fields stretching across central North Carolina, a transaction took place that would end in flames before the sun set again. The records are incomplete. Deliberately so, some say. What we know is this: a child was sold. A mother watched. And by dawn on December 26th, one of the wealthiest estates in the region was nothing but ash and bone. The official inquiry blamed faulty lanterns. But the people who lived through it, the ones who survived, they whispered a different story. A story about a woman named Ruth, a price paid in silver, and a fire that burned so hot it melted the iron gates at the entrance. What really happened that Christmas night has been buried for over a century and a half, hidden in courthouse basements and family archives that were never meant to see daylight. Before we continue with the story of Ruth and the fire that consumed Hargrove Estate, if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And I'd love to know. Drop a comment below telling me what state or city you're listening from. Now, let's go back to North Carolina, 1858, and uncover what really happened on that Christmas. The winter of 1858 had been unusually mild across the Piedmont region of North Carolina, where the Hargrove Estate sat on nearly 400 acres of prime tobacco land. The estate was one of the oldest in Randolph County, established in 1791 by Colonel William Hargrove, a veteran of the Revolutionary War who'd been granted the land as payment for his service. The colonel had been a practical man, not given to sentiment or grand gestures. He'd built his house with thick walls and small windows, designed to keep out the summer heat and winter cold. He'd planted his first tobacco crop in the spring of 1792, using seeds he'd brought from Virginia, and by harvest time that year, he'd turned a profit. By the time his grandson, Edmund Hargrove, inherited the property in 1852, it had grown into a sprawling operation. 3 tobacco barns, a main house with 12 rooms, a separate kitchen building, stables, a smokehouse, a blacksmith's forge, a carpenter's workshop, and quarters for the 43 enslaved people who worked the land. The estate produced nearly 20,000 pounds of tobacco annually, most of it shipped to Richmond and then on to markets in Europe. Edmund Hargrove was 34 years old when he took over the estate. He'd been educated at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where he'd studied law but never practiced. Instead, he'd returned home to manage the family business. He was known in the county as a businessman first, a planter second. He kept meticulous records. Every bushel of tobacco, every tool, every transaction, it all went into leather-bound ledgers that he stored in a locked cabinet in his study. The ledgers were his pride. He could tell you at any moment exactly how much the estate was worth, down to the last dollar. He was married to a woman named Caroline, the daughter of a Charleston merchant family. She was 28 years old, pale and thin, with a nervous disposition that had worsened after the birth of their second son. She spent most of her time in the upstairs rooms of the main house, reading novels and writing letters to her sisters back in South Carolina. She rarely ventured outside, and when she did, she wore a wide-brimmed hat and gloves, even in winter. Their 2 sons, William and James, were 7 and 5 years old respectively. They were looked after by an enslaved woman named Bess, who'd been with the family since before Edmund was born. Bess was in her 60s, grey-haired and stooped, but still sharp-minded. She'd raised Edmund and his 2 sisters, and now she was raising his sons. She slept in a small room off the kitchen, close enough to hear if the boys woke in the night. The estate itself was laid out in a grid pattern, with the main house at the center. To the east were the tobacco fields, stretching nearly 200 acres. To the west were the vegetable gardens, the orchards, and the livestock pens. To the north were the barns and workshops, and to the south, separated from the main house by a wide dirt road, were the quarters, a row of 12 small cabins where the enslaved people lived. By all accounts, Edmund Hargrove was unremarkable, not particularly cruel by the standards of the time, but not kind either. He didn't whip his workers himself. He left that to his overseer, a man named Cyrus Dalton. But he didn't intervene when Dalton did. He provided adequate food and clothing, but nothing more. He allowed the enslaved people to keep small gardens behind their cabins, and he gave them Christmas Day off from work. But he charged them for any supplies they needed beyond what he provided. He ran his estate the way he ran everything else in his life, with cold efficiency and an eye always on profit. Ruth had been born on the Hargrove estate in the spring of 1834. Her mother, Dinah, had been brought to the estate as a young woman in the 1820s, purchased from a trader in Fayetteville. Dinah had worked in the main house as a cook, a position that carried a certain status among the enslaved community. She was known for her skill with bread and pastries, and Caroline Hargrove had relied on her heavily, especially during the years when she was pregnant and unable to manage the household herself. Ruth had grown up in the main house, helping her mother in the kitchen. She'd learned to read by watching the Hargrove children do their lessons, and she'd learned to cook by standing at her mother's elbow, watching her knead dough and stir pots. She was a quiet child, observant and careful, with her mother's dark eyes and quick hands. When Ruth was 11, Dinah fell ill with a fever. It came on suddenly in the middle of summer, and within 3 days she was dead. The doctor who examined her said it was likely typhoid, though he couldn't be certain. She was buried in the small cemetery behind the quarters in an unmarked grave next to a dozen others. After Dinah's death, Ruth was moved to the fields. She was too young to work the tobacco rows, so she was assigned to lighter tasks, carrying water, pulling weeds, gathering the leaves after they'd been cut. By the time she was 14, she was working full days, bent over the rows from dawn until dusk, her hands stained brown from the tobacco sap. She was 17 when she met Samuel. Samuel had been born on a plantation in Virginia and sold south when he was 15. He'd been purchased by Edmund Hargrove in 1850, along with 3 other men, to work in the tobacco barns. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet strength that made him well-liked among the other workers. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. He noticed Ruth one Sunday afternoon in the late summer of 1851. She was sitting by the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, washing clothes. He'd come down to the water to fill a bucket, and he'd seen her there, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth. He'd said something, he couldn't remember what, later, and she'd looked up and smiled. They were married in the spring of 1852, in the way enslaved people married. There was no legal ceremony, no official record, but on a Sunday evening in April they stood together in front of the other people in the quarters, and an older man named Jacob, who'd been a preacher before he was sold, spoke a few words over them. Afterward, there was a small celebration. Someone had managed to get hold of a chicken, and there was cornbread and greens, and someone played a fiddle. Samuel moved into Ruth's cabin, a small one-room structure with a dirt floor and a single window. They had a bed made from rough planks and a straw mattress, a table, 2 stools, and a fireplace. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. For a while, life settled into a rhythm. They worked the fields during the day, and in the evenings they'd sit by the fire and talk. Samuel would carve small things out of wood, spoons, bowls, toys. Ruth would mend clothes or braid strips of cloth into rugs. On Sundays, they'd walk down to the creek and sit by the water, watching the sun set over the fields. Their daughter was born in March of 1857, on a cold, rainy night. Ruth had gone into labor in the afternoon, and by midnight the baby was born. Samuel had stayed with her the whole time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. When the baby finally came, small and red-faced and wailing, he'd wrapped her in a blanket and handed her to Ruth. Ruth had looked down at the tiny face, the dark eyes blinking up at her, and she'd felt something shift inside her chest. A fierce, protective love that was almost painful in its intensity. She named her Lily after the flowers that grew wild near the creek. Lily was a healthy baby, bright-eyed and quick to smile. She had Ruth's dark eyes and Samuel's broad forehead. By the time she was 6 months old, she was laughing and reaching for things, and by the time she was a year old, she was pulling herself up to stand, holding on to the edge of the table. Ruth would carry her into the fields in a sling made from old cloth, setting her down in the shade while she worked the rows. In the evenings, she'd sing to her, old songs Dinah had taught her, songs that had been passed down through generations, songs about rivers and roads and freedom. Samuel doted on the child. He'd carve little toys for her out of scraps of wood, animals mostly, a horse, a bird, a rabbit. He'd make them move and dance while Lily laughed and reached for them with her small hands. He'd talk to her in a soft voice, telling her stories about places he'd never been, places he'd only heard about from other people, places where the land was flat and wide, where you could walk for days and never see another person, places where people were free. For a brief time, despite everything, there was something close to happiness in that small cabin in the quarters. But Edmund Hargrove's ledgers told a different story. The tobacco crop of 1857 had been poor. A late frost in April had damaged the seedlings, and then a dry summer had stunted growth. The plants had been small and weak, the leaves thin and brittle. The harvest brought in less than half of what Hargrove had projected. By the fall, he was in debt to a merchant in Greensboro who'd extended him credit for seed and supplies. The merchant wanted payment. Hargrove didn't have it. He'd spent the winter trying to figure out how to cover the debt. He'd considered selling some of the land, but land prices were low, and he didn't want to break up the estate. He'd considered taking out a loan, but the banks were wary of lending to planters after the panic of 1857, when several large estates in the region had gone bankrupt. In November, a man named Josiah Trent arrived at the estate. Trent was a slave trader based out of Richmond, Virginia, but he traveled a circuit through North Carolina and South Carolina, buying and selling human beings the way other men bought and sold livestock. He was in his 40s, a large man with a thick beard and cold eyes. He wore expensive clothes, a wool coat, leather boots, a gold watch chain, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew his business was profitable. He was known for paying cash, and he didn't ask too many questions. Hargrove met with him in the study. The meeting lasted 2 hours. They sat across from each other at Hargrove's desk, Trent with a ledger of his own, listing the current prices for men, women, and children in various markets. Hargrove had his own ledgers open, showing the names and ages of everyone on the estate. They negotiated. Trent was interested in young men, field hands who could be sold to plantations further south, where the cotton industry was booming. Hargrove was reluctant to sell his best workers, but he needed the money. They settled on 3 men, all in their 20s, all strong and healthy. Trent would pay $800 each, but that wasn't enough to cover the debt. Trent leaned back in his chair and looked at the ledger again. "You got any children?" he asked. Hargrove hesitated. "A few." "Light-skinned?" Hargrove nodded slowly. Trent smiled. "Light-skinned children fetch a good price in Richmond, especially girls. People like to buy them young, raise them in the house, teach them to sew, cook, clean. They're easier to train when they're young." Hargrove didn't say anything. "I'll give you $200 for a healthy child," Trent said. $250 if she's particularly light." Hargrove looked down at his ledger. He ran his finger down the list of names until he found what he was looking for. "Lily," he said, "born March 1857, daughter of Ruth and Samuel." Trent made a note in his own ledger. "I'll take her." When Trent left, he had a list of names. 4 people, 3 men and 1 child. Ruth's name wasn't on it, but Lily's was. Christmas Day, 1858, began like most winter mornings on the estate, cold and grey, with a thin fog hanging over the fields. The temperature had dropped overnight, and there was frost on the ground, crunching underfoot. The enslaved people had been given the day off from work, as was customary. It was one of the few days of the year when they didn't have to be in the fields at dawn. Some gathered in the quarters, sharing what little food they'd managed to save or trade for. Others stayed in their cabins, trying to keep warm. Ruth woke early. Lily was fussy, teething and feverish. She'd been up half the night, crying and squirming, and Ruth had held her close, rocking her gently, singing softly. Samuel had gone to the main house before dawn. Hargrove had called for him to help move some furniture in preparation for a small gathering he was hosting that evening. He'd promised to be back by midday. Ruth sat by the fire, holding Lily in her lap. The baby was quieter now, her eyes half closed, her small fist wrapped around Ruth's finger. Ruth hummed softly, the same song her mother had sung to her when she was a child. A song about a river and a road and a place where the sun always shone. Around 10 in the morning, there was a knock on the cabin door. Ruth looked up. She knew immediately that something was wrong. No one knocked on Christmas morning. No one came to the cabins unless there was trouble. She stood slowly, still holding Lily. She crossed the small room and opened the door. It was Edmund Hargrove, and behind him, Josiah Trent. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, instinctively pulling Lily closer. Hargrove's face was expressionless. He didn't look at Ruth directly. He looked past her, into the cabin as if he were inspecting it. "The child's been sold," he said. His voice was flat, businesslike. "Trent's taking her to Richmond this afternoon." Ruth's hands tightened around Lily. The baby squirmed, whimpering. "No," Ruth said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Hargrove finally looked at her. His expression didn't change. "It's done. The papers are signed." Ruth shook her head. Please, she's just a baby. She's not even 2 years old." Trent stepped forward. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a face that showed no emotion. "Make it easy on yourself," he said. "Hand her over." Ruth backed toward the far wall of the cabin. "Please," she said again. "Please don't do this." "She'll fetch a good price in Richmond," Trent said. "Light-skinned children always do. Someone will raise her in a house, teach her to sew or cook. She'll have a better life than she'd have here." "She's my daughter." Hargrove's voice was cold. "She's my property, and I need the money." Ruth looked at him, really looked at him, at his expensive coat, his polished boots, his clean hands, at the gold watch chain hanging from his vest pocket, at the face that showed no trace of guilt or hesitation. "You're selling my baby on Christmas," she said. Her voice was shaking now. "On Christmas." Hargrove didn't respond. What happened next was over in less than a minute. Trent moved quickly, crossing the small cabin in 2 strides. He grabbed Lily from Ruth's arms, pulling her away with a practiced efficiency that suggested he'd done this many times before. The baby screamed, a high, piercing wail that cut through the cold morning air. Ruth lunged forward, trying to grab Lily back, but Hargrove caught her by the arm, holding her back. She fought, clawing at his hands, kicking, screaming, but he was stronger. He twisted her arm behind her back, forcing her to her knees. Trent was already out the door, Lily wailing in his arms. Ruth screamed. It was a sound that came from somewhere deep inside her, a sound of pure anguish. She screamed until her voice broke, until her throat was raw. Hargrove released her and stepped back. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing. He looked down at her for a moment, his expression still cold and distant. "You'll get over it," he said. Then he turned and walked out, closing the door behind him. Ruth stayed on the floor, her body shaking with sobs. She could still hear Lily crying, the sound growing fainter as Trent carried her away. She could hear the creak of a wagon, the jingle of harness, the sound of horses' hooves on the frozen ground. And then, silence. By noon, Josiah Trent's wagon was gone, heading north toward Virginia. Lily was in the back, wrapped in a blanket, still crying. The 3 men Hargrove had sold were chained in the wagon bed, their faces blank with shock and resignation. Ruth didn't move from the floor of the cabin for hours. When Samuel returned and found her there, he didn't speak. He just knelt beside her and held her while she cried. But eventually the tears stopped, and when they did, something else took their place. Something cold and hard and unbreakable. That evening, as the sun set and the temperature dropped, Ruth finally stood. She walked out of the cabin, across the quarters, and toward the main house. Samuel tried to follow her, but she told him to stay back. "Don't follow me," she said. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made him stop. She didn't go to the front door. She went to the kitchen building, a separate structure connected to the main house by a covered walkway. The fire in the hearth was still burning. It was always kept lit during the winter to make cooking easier in the mornings. Ruth stood there for a long time, staring at the flames. She thought about Dinah, her mother, who'd worked in this kitchen for 20 years before she died. She thought about all the meals she'd helped prepare, all the hours she'd spent standing at this hearth, cooking food for people who saw her as nothing more than a tool. She thought about Lily, about her small hands and bright eyes, about the way she laughed when Samuel made the wooden animals dance, about the way she'd reached for Ruth that morning, her fingers grasping at air as Trent carried her away. And she thought about Edmund Hargrove, about his cold eyes and his ledgers and his gold watch chain, about the way he'd said, "You'll get over it," as if losing a child was no different than losing a tool or a piece of furniture. She reached down and picked up a burning log from the hearth. The heat seared her hands, but she didn't let go. She carried it through the covered walkway and into the main house. She went to the study first, the room where Hargrove kept his ledgers, the room where he'd sat with Josiah Trent and negotiated the price of her daughter's life. She set the burning log on the desk, on top of the open ledger. The paper caught fire immediately, the flames spreading quickly across the pages. She watched for a moment, watching the names burn. All those names, all those people who'd been bought and sold, reduced to entries in a ledger. Then she turned and walked out. She went to the parlor next, where Caroline Hargrove kept her expensive furniture and her imported rugs. She set fire to the curtains, watching them go up in flames. Then the dining room, the sitting room, the hallway. By the time she reached the front door, the entire first floor was burning. She walked out into the cold night air and stood in the yard, watching the flames spread. She could hear shouting now, people running, someone screaming. But she didn't move. She just stood there, her hands blistered and bleeding, watching the house burn. The fire burned for hours, consuming not just wood and brick, but the illusion of order that men like Edmund Hargrove tried to impose on a system built on human suffering. By the time the first neighbors arrived, drawn by the glow visible for miles across the flat Piedmont landscape, there was nothing to be done. The main house was engulfed, flames shooting 30 feet into the air. The heat was so intense that people couldn't get within 50 yards of the structure. They formed a bucket line from the well anyway, more out of instinct than hope, passing water hand to hand in a futile attempt to contain the blaze. Edmund Hargrove and his family had escaped through a second-floor window on the east side of the house. Caroline had jumped first, landing badly and breaking her ankle. The two boys had been lowered down by their father, then caught by Bess, who'd been one of the first to see the flames. Hargrove had been the last out, and by the time he hit the ground, his nightshirt was singed and his face was blackened with smoke. They huddled together in the yard, wrapped in blankets someone had brought from the quarters, watching their home burn. William, the older boy, was crying. James, the younger one, just stared at the flames, his eyes wide and unblinking. Caroline was in shock, her broken ankle twisted at an unnatural angle, her face pale and sweating despite the cold. The enslaved people from the quarters had come running when they saw the fire. Some joined the bucket line. Others tried to save what they could from the outbuildings, the smokehouse, the stables, the tobacco barns. The kitchen building, connected to the main house by the covered walkway, caught fire around midnight and burned completely. One of the tobacco barns, downwind from the main house, caught sparks and was lost as well. By dawn on December 26th, the main house was nothing but a smoking ruin. The walls had collapsed inward, leaving only the brick chimney standing blackened and cracked. The iron gates at the entrance to the property had warped from the heat. Their decorative scrollwork melted and twisted. Ruth was found sitting on the ground near the remains of the house, her hands burned and blistered, her dress singed and torn. She didn't resist when Cyrus Dalton, the overseer, grabbed her by the arm and pulled her to her feet. She didn't say a word. Samuel tried to go to her, but Dalton shoved him back. "Stay where you are," he said. Ruth looked at Samuel once, just once. Her eyes were dry. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, and then she looked away. Dalton took her to the barn and locked her inside. The inquiry began 2 days later. The county sheriff, a man named Thomas Garrett, came to the estate with a deputy and a clerk to take statements. He interviewed Edmund Hargrove first, then Caroline, then several of the enslaved people who'd been present when the fire started. Hargrove's account was straightforward. He'd been asleep when the fire started. He'd woken to the smell of smoke and the sound of his wife screaming. He'd gotten his family out as quickly as he could. He believed the fire had been caused by a lantern left burning in the kitchen, or perhaps a spark from the hearth. But when pressed, he admitted that Ruth had been seen near the kitchen building shortly before the fire started, and when asked why she might have been there, he hesitated. There was an incident earlier in the day, he said finally. A child was sold. The child's mother was upset. Sheriff Garrett made a note in his ledger. Upset enough to set fire to your house? Hargrove didn't answer directly. I don't know what she was thinking, but she was the last person seen near the kitchen before the fire started. The sheriff interviewed Ruth the next day. She was still in the barn, her hands wrapped in strips of cloth that Bess had brought her. She sat on the dirt floor, her back against the wall, staring at nothing. Did you set the fire? Garrett asked. Ruth didn't respond. If you confess, it'll go easier for you, he said. The judge might show leniency. Ruth looked at him. Her eyes were empty. What will you do to me? She asked. Her voice was hoarse from screaming the day before. That's up to the judge, Garrett said. Will you hang me? Garrett shifted uncomfortably. That's up to the judge, he said again. Ruth looked away. Then it doesn't matter what I say. The inquiry concluded 3 days later. The official finding was inconclusive. There was no direct evidence that Ruth had set the fire, only circumstantial evidence and suspicion. But there was also no other explanation that made sense. Edmund Hargrove, despite everything, didn't push for a trial. Some said it was because he didn't want the attention. A trial would mean newspapers, questions, scrutiny. It would mean people asking why he'd sold a baby on Christmas morning. It would mean his business dealings, his debts, his ledgers, all of it would become public. Others said it was because he knew what a trial would reveal. That he'd sold a child for $200 in silver. That he'd torn a family apart to pay off a debt. That he'd done it on Christmas of all days. Whatever his reasons, he made a decision. Ruth would be sold, quietly, quickly, to someone far enough away that the story wouldn't follow her. 3 weeks later, a broker from Charleston arrived at the estate. His name was Marcus Finch, and he specialized in what he called difficult cases, enslaved people who'd run away or fought back or caused trouble. He paid less than market value, but he paid cash, and he didn't ask questions. He paid Edmund Hargrove $150 for Ruth, $50 less than Hargrove had gotten for Lily. Ruth was taken away on a cold morning in late January. She didn't say goodbye to Samuel. She didn't look back at the quarters, or the fields, or the ruins of the main house. She just climbed into the back of Finch's wagon and sat down, her hands still bandaged, her face expressionless. Samuel watched her go. He stood in the yard outside their cabin, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just watched until the wagon disappeared down the road. That night, he went into the cabin and found the small wooden rabbit he'd carved for Lily. He held it in his hands for a long time, running his fingers over the smooth wood, remembering the way Lily had laughed when he made it hop across the table. Then he wrapped it in a piece of cloth and buried it beneath the floorboards, in the corner where Lily's cradle had been. The years that followed were hard ones for the Hargrove estate. Edmund Hargrove rebuilt, but it took time and money he didn't have. He borrowed from banks in Greensboro and Raleigh, putting up the land as collateral. He hired new workers to replace the ones he'd sold. But they were expensive, and the tobacco crops continued to be unpredictable. By 1860, the estate was barely breaking even. Hargrove had built a new house, smaller and simpler than the original, with fewer rooms and no decorative details. It was functional, nothing more. He'd also rebuilt the kitchen as a separate structure, but this time he'd had it built farther from the main house, with a stone foundation and a brick chimney that extended well above the roofline. He'd become obsessed with fire safety. Every door in the new house had a lock. Every window had shutters that could be barred from the inside. He kept buckets of water stationed at intervals around the property, and he'd had a bell installed near the main house that could be rung in case of emergency. He also kept a rifle by his bed, and he slept poorly. Caroline never fully recovered from the fire. Her ankle healed badly, leaving her with a permanent limp. But the physical injury was nothing compared to the psychological one. She'd developed a terror of fire that bordered on obsession. She refused to allow candles in the house, insisting that only oil lamps be used, and even then, only in rooms where someone was present. She wouldn't let the boys play near the hearth. She had nightmares, waking in the middle of the night screaming that she smelled smoke. By 1861, she'd stopped leaving the house entirely. She spent her days in the upstairs bedroom, reading the same books over and over, writing letters to her sisters that she never sent. She rarely spoke to Edmund, and when she did, it was only to ask about the locks on the doors or the water in the buckets. The boys grew up in the shadow of the fire. William, the older one, became quiet and withdrawn. He'd wake in the night sometimes, crying, saying he dreamed about the flames. James, the younger one, developed a stutter that he never fully outgrew. The enslaved people on the estate spoke about the fire in whispers. They didn't talk about it openly, not where Hargrove or Dalton could hear, but among themselves they told the story. About Ruth and Lily, about Christmas morning, about the way Ruth had walked into the main house with a burning log in her hands. Some said she'd been right to do it, that Hargrove had deserved to lose his house, his wealth, his sense of security, that he'd taken something from her that could never be replaced, and she'd taken something from him in return. Others said it had been a mistake, that Ruth had only made things worse for herself and for everyone else, that the fire had accomplished nothing except to bring more suffering. But everyone agreed on one thing. Ruth had made a choice. She'd decided that if she couldn't have her daughter, Edmund Hargrove wouldn't have his house. Samuel never spoke about Ruth after she was taken away. He worked in the tobacco barns the same as before, but he was quieter now. He didn't carve anymore. He didn't sing. He kept to himself, and people learned not to ask him questions. In the spring of 1861, when the war started, several of the younger men on the estate tried to run away, hoping to reach Union lines. 2 of them made it. 3 were caught and brought back. Samuel didn't try to run. He just kept working, day after day, his face expressionless, his hands moving through the familiar motions of stripping tobacco leaves and hanging them to dry. In 1863, Cyrus Dalton, the overseer, was conscripted into the Confederate Army. He was killed at Gettysburg in July of that year. Edmund Hargrove tried to manage the estate himself after that, but he was overwhelmed. The tobacco crops failed 2 years in a row. The workers, sensing that the war might bring changes, became less cooperative. Some simply stopped working, daring Hargrove to do something about it. By 1865, when the war ended, the estate was in ruins. The fields were overgrown. The barns were falling apart. The new house, only 5 years old, already looked worn and neglected. When the Emancipation Proclamation reached North Carolina, Samuel was one of the first to leave. He walked off the estate on a warm morning in May, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the small wooden rabbit he'd dug up from beneath the floorboards of his cabin. He walked north, following the roads toward Virginia. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't have a plan. He just knew he couldn't stay. He never found Lily. He tried. He asked everyone he met if they'd heard of a light-skinned girl, about 8 years old by then, who might have been sold in Richmond in 1858. But no one knew anything. The records had been destroyed in the war. The traders were dead or scattered. The trail was cold. He settled eventually in a small town in southern Virginia, working as a carpenter. He never married again. He never had other children. He kept the wooden rabbit on a shelf in his room, and sometimes late at night he'd take it down and hold it, remembering. He died in 1891 at the age of 63. He was buried in a small cemetery outside the town, in an unmarked grave. Edmund Hargrove held on to the estate until 1871. By then he was 47 years old, and he looked 20 years older. His hair had gone grey, his hands shook. He'd developed a persistent cough that the doctor said was from the smoke he'd inhaled the night of the fire, though it had been more than a decade. In the spring of 1871, he had what the doctor called a failure of the heart. He collapsed in the study of the new house, the same room where he kept his ledgers. He was found by one of the workers, slumped over his desk, his hand still holding a pen. He was buried in the family plot on the estate, next to his father and grandfather. Caroline and the boys moved back to Charleston shortly after. Caroline died in 1875. William became a clerk in a shipping company and never married. James moved west to Texas and disappeared from the records. The estate itself changed hands several times over the following decades. The new house was torn down in 1885. The land was subdivided and sold off in pieces. By 1900, the only thing left of the original Hargrove estate was the family cemetery and a few crumbling foundations hidden in the underbrush. But the story didn't end there. In 1923, a man named Robert Vance bought 50 acres of the old Hargrove property, including the grove where the main house had stood. Vance was a veteran of the First World War, originally from Pennsylvania, who'd moved south looking for cheap land to farm. He was in his early 40s, unmarried, with a limp from a piece of shrapnel that had lodged in his left leg during the Battle of the Argonne Forest. He cleared part of the grove and built a small house near the creek. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, a front porch. He planted a vegetable garden and kept a few chickens. He lived there alone, content with the quiet and the solitude. For the first year, everything was fine. He worked the land, sold vegetables at the market in town, and kept to himself. The neighbors were friendly enough, though they found him a bit odd. He didn't attend church, he didn't socialize, he just worked his land and stayed in his house. But in the summer of 1924, things started to change. It began with small things. Vance would wake in the middle of the night and smell smoke. Not wood smoke, like from a chimney, but something else. Something acrid and chemical, like burning fabric or tar. He'd get up and check the house, but there was never anything burning. The fireplace would be cold, the stove would be off. The smell would linger for a few minutes and then it would fade. He told himself it was his imagination, a trick of the mind, brought on by memories of the war. He'd smelled burning things in France, burning wood, burning flesh, burning earth. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But then he started hearing things, footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth. He'd get up and go to the door, but there'd be no one there, just the empty porch and the dark yard beyond. And sometimes late at night he'd hear a woman's voice, singing. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A low, mournful song in a language he didn't recognize. Or maybe it was English, but the words were too distorted to make out. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it was the wind, or an animal, or his own mind playing tricks on him again. But the sounds continued, night after night. The footsteps, the singing, the smell of smoke. In the fall of 1924, he decided to dig a new well. The old one, near the house, had started to run dry, and he needed a more reliable water source. He chose a spot about 30 yards from the house, near where he thought the original main house had stood. He started digging on a cool morning in October. The ground was hard, packed clay mixed with rocks. He worked slowly, breaking up the soil with a pickaxe and shoveling it out. By midday, he was about 4 feet down. That's when the shovel hit something hard. He thought it was a rock at first, but when he cleared the dirt away, he saw that it was metal. A box, rectangular, about the size of a small trunk made of iron and badly rusted. It was locked. Vance stared at it for a long time. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to leave it buried, to fill in the hole and forget he'd ever found it. But another part of him, The part that had survived the war, the part that had learned to face things head-on, wanted to know what was inside. He used a hammer to break the lock. It took several tries, but eventually the rusted metal gave way. Inside the box were papers, ledgers, old, yellowed, brittle with age. Some of them were water-damaged, the ink faded and illegible, but others were still readable. Vance lifted them out carefully and spread them on the ground. They were account books, records of transactions, dates, names, amounts. He read through them slowly, his hands shaking slightly. They were records of people, enslaved people, bought and sold like livestock. Each entry had a name, an age, a description, and a price. Jacob, male, age 28, strong back, good worker, $800. Sarah, female, age 19, house-trained, $600. Moses, male, age 35, skilled carpenter, $900. Page after page, dozens of names, dozens of lives reduced to entries in a ledger. And then, near the bottom of one page, he found an entry that made him stop. Lily, female. Born March 12, 1857, light-skinned, sold December 25, 1858, $200. Beneath it, in different handwriting, smaller, more cramped, written in pencil rather than ink, someone had added a note. He took my child. I took his house. We are even now. Vance sat back on his heels, staring at the words. He didn't know who had written them. He didn't know the full story. But he knew enough. He looked up at the grove, at the trees that had grown over the ruins of the old house. He thought about the smell of smoke, the footsteps, the singing, and he understood. He gathered up the ledgers, carried them back to his house, and burned them in the fireplace. He watched the pages curl and blacken, the names disappearing into ash. He didn't want them. He didn't want to know anymore. But burning the ledgers didn't help. The sounds continued. The smell of smoke, the footsteps, the singing. By the spring of 1925, Vance couldn't take it anymore. He sold the property and moved back north to Pennsylvania. He never spoke about what he'd found. Not for nearly 30 years. It wasn't until 1954, when he was 73 years old and living in a veterans' home in Harrisburg, that he finally told the story to a reporter from a local newspaper who was researching the history of Randolph County. "I don't believe in ghosts," Vance said, sitting in a chair by the window of the home, looking out at the gray Pennsylvania sky. "I never have. But I'll tell you this, something was wrong with that land. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just my mind. Maybe it was the war. But I couldn't stay there." The reporter asked if he'd told anyone else about the ledgers. Vance shook his head. Who would I tell, and what would it change? They're all dead now, everyone involved. It's just history. But history, as it turns out, doesn't always stay buried. In 1968, a graduate student named Margaret Colby was researching her thesis on enslaved families in the antebellum South. She was 24 years old, studying at Duke University, and she'd been combing through courthouse records in Randolph County when she came across a reference to the Hargrove estate fire. It was a brief mention, just a few lines in an old inquiry report from 1859, but something about it caught her attention. A fire on Christmas night. A woman suspected of arson. A child sold that same morning. She started digging deeper. She found the inquiry report, which was brief and inconclusive. She found property records showing the sale of the estate in pieces over the years. She found tax documents, census records, and family histories. And then, in a box of miscellaneous documents that had been misfiled in the basement of the courthouse, she found a letter. It was dated January 15th, 1859, and it was addressed to Edmund Hargrove from a man named Reverend Thomas Whitley, a Methodist minister who'd served several congregations in the area. The letter was short, handwritten in careful script on yellowed paper. "Mr. Hargrove, I write to you with a heavy heart. I have heard what transpired on Christmas Day, and I have heard what followed. I do not presume to judge you, for judgment belongs to God alone. But I must tell you this, the woman Ruth came to me before she was taken away. She did not confess to setting the fire. She did not deny it either. She said only this: "He took my child. I took his house. We are even now. I fear, Mr. Hargrove, that you are not even. I fear that what you have sown, you will reap in ways you cannot yet imagine. I urge you to seek forgiveness, not from me but from the Lord, and to make amends where you can. Your servant in Christ, Reverend Thomas Whitley." Margaret Colby made a copy of the letter and included it in her thesis. The thesis was titled, "Fractured Families: The Impact of Child Sales on Enslaved Communities in North Carolina, 1820–1865. It was well researched and carefully argued, but it was never published. She left graduate school in 1970 to get married and never returned to finish her degree. But a copy of the thesis ended up in the archives of the North Carolina State University Library, where it sat, largely unnoticed, for decades. In 2003, a historian named Dr. Alan Pritchard came across Colby's thesis while researching a book on resistance among enslaved people in North Carolina. He was in his 50s, a professor at a small college in Virginia, and he'd spent most of his career studying the ways enslaved people had fought back against the system that oppressed them. He was struck by the letter from Reverend Whitley and decided to investigate further. He spent the next 2 years tracking down every piece of information he could find about the Hargrove estate, Ruth, and the fire. He combed through property records, tax documents, and family histories. He searched for descendants of people who'd been enslaved on the estate. He traveled to South Carolina, trying to find records of Ruth after she was sold, but he came up empty. The records had been destroyed, lost, or never kept in the first place. But he did find descendants, people whose great-great-grandparents had been enslaved on the Hargrove estate, people who'd heard stories passed down through their families. One of the people he interviewed was a woman named Evelyn Morris. She was 91 years old, living in a nursing home in Greensboro. She was sharp-minded and clear-eyed, and she remembered the stories her grandmother had told her. "My great-great-grandmother's name was Dinah," Evelyn said, sitting in a chair by the window of her room, her hands folded in her lap. She was Ruth's mother. She died when Ruth was young, but before she died, she made Ruth promise something. She made her promise that no matter what happened, she'd never let them break her. She'd never let them take everything. Evelyn paused, looking out the window at the parking lot beyond. When they took Lily, Ruth kept that promise. She didn't let them take everything. She took something back. Dr. Pritchard asked if Evelyn knew what had happened to Ruth after she was sold. "She died," Evelyn said quietly, "in South Carolina. I don't know when exactly. Sometime before the war ended, I think. But before she died, she sent a message back. It was passed along through people who traveled between plantations. The message was simple: 'Tell Samuel I kept my promise.'" Pritchard asked what the promise was. Evelyn looked at him. The promise she made to her mother, that she'd never let them break her. Dr. Pritchard published his findings in a journal article in 2005. The article was titled "Resistance and Retribution: The Hargrove Estate Fire of 1858. It was published in the Journal of Southern History, and it received some attention in academic circles. A few other historians cited it in their own work, but it didn't reach a wider audience until 2017. In 2017, a documentary filmmaker named Jessica Huang was working on a project about untold stories of resistance during slavery. She was in her 30s, based in New York, and she'd been researching for months, looking for stories that hadn't been told before. Stories that would challenge people's assumptions about what resistance looked like. She came across Pritchard's article and reached out to him. They talked on the phone for hours. Pritchard told her everything he'd found, the letter, the interviews, the records. He told her about Evelyn Morris and the message Ruth had sent back. Jessica was fascinated. She decided to make a documentary about the story. She and Pritchard traveled to Randolph County together in the spring of 2017. They located the land where the Hargrove estate had once stood. It was now part of a larger farm, owned by a family who'd had the property for 3 generations. The current owner, a man named Dale Hutchins, was in his 60s, a tobacco farmer who'd inherited the land from his father. Jessica and Pritchard explained what they were doing, and Hutchins gave them permission to explore the property. They brought ground-penetrating radar equipment and a small team of archaeologists from the University of North Carolina. They spent 2 weeks surveying the land, mapping the locations of the old buildings, searching for anything that might have survived. What they found was remarkable. Beneath the grove of pine trees in the area where the main house had stood, they discovered the remains of the foundation. The bricks were blackened and cracked from the fire, but they were still there, buried under decades of soil and leaf litter. And beneath the foundation they found something else. A small stone-lined pit, carefully constructed, hidden beneath what would have been the floor of the study. Inside the pit were the remnants of burned ledgers, pages blackened and brittle, but still partially legible. The archaeologists carefully excavated them, using brushes and tweezers to lift the fragments. And among the pages, they found something that shouldn't have been there. A small wooden carving of a rabbit. It was about 3 inches long, carved from a single piece of wood. The details were still visible: the long ears, the rounded body, the small tail. It had been carefully made, lovingly crafted. Jessica held it in her hands, turning it over, examining it. She looked at Pritchard. "This is Samuel's carving," she said. "The one he made for Lily." Pritchard nodded slowly. "But how did it get here? Samuel left after the war. He took the carving with him." They looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. "Ruth," Jessica said. "Ruth must have had it. Somehow she got it back. And she buried it here, beneath the house, beneath the ledgers." The implications were staggering. Ruth hadn't just set the fire in a moment of rage. She'd planned it. She'd gone into the study, found the ledgers, the records of every person Hargrove had bought and sold, and she'd burned them. Not just to destroy the house, but to destroy the documentation, to erase, as much as she could, the transactions that had torn families apart. And she'd left the carving there, hidden beneath the floor, as a marker. A message. Dr. Pritchard, reviewing the findings later, offered his interpretation in an interview for the documentary. Ruth knew she couldn't save Lily. She knew she couldn't undo what had been done, but she could make sure that Hargrove's records, his meticulous documentation of human suffering, didn't survive. She could take that away from him. And she did. The carving was her way of saying, "This is for Lily. This is for all of us. You can't erase us. We were here. We mattered." Jessica Huang's documentary, titled The Fire That Ruth Set, premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2018. It won the award for Best Documentary Feature and was eventually picked up by a major streaming service, where it reached millions of viewers. The documentary sparked intense debates. Some saw Ruth as a hero, a woman who'd fought back against an impossible system in the only way she could. Others argued that the fire had been an act of desperation, not resistance, and that romanticizing it ignored the complexity of her situation and the danger she'd put others in. Historians debated the evidence. Some questioned whether Ruth had really planned the fire, or whether the carving had ended up in the pit by accident. Others pointed out that the message written in the ledger, "He took my child. I took his house. We are even now," was clear evidence of intent. But everyone agreed on one thing: Ruth had made a choice. On Christmas night, 1858, she decided that if she couldn't have her daughter, Edmund Hargrove wouldn't have his house, his records, or his sense of security. She'd taken something back. The land where the Hargrove estate once stood is quiet now. The pine grove remains, though some of the trees have been cleared over the years to make room for new growth. The foundations of the old buildings are still there, hidden beneath the soil, slowly being reclaimed by the earth. In 2019, the County Historical Society installed a small marker near the road. It's made of granite, about 3 feet tall, with a bronze plaque that reads, "Site of the Hargrove Estate, established 1791. Destroyed by fire, December 25th, 1858, a place of labor, loss, and resistance. In memory of Ruth, Lily, Samuel, and all those whose names were lost." Dale Hutchins, the current owner of the land, has said he doesn't mind visitors as long as they're respectful. Some people come to see the site. Some leave flowers near the marker. A few have left small wooden carvings, rabbits, birds, horses, in memory of Lily and the other children who were taken from their families. The wooden rabbit that was found beneath the foundation is now in the collection of the North Carolina Museum of History in Raleigh. It's displayed in a glass case, along with fragments of the burned ledgers and a copy of the letter from Reverend Whitley. The exhibit is titled Resistance and Remembrance, the Hargrove Estate Fire. Ruth's final resting place is unknown. Despite extensive research, no records of her death have been found. There's no grave marker, no documentation of what happened to her after she was sold to South Carolina in 1859. Some researchers believe she may have died during the war when record-keeping broke down across the South. Others think she may have survived and taken a new name, disappearing into the chaos of Reconstruction. But her story, once buried in courthouse basements and family memories, is now part of the historical record. Lily's fate remains a mystery. Josiah Trent's records were destroyed in a warehouse fire in Richmond in 1862, and there's no way to trace what happened to her after she left Randolph County on Christmas Day, 1858. Some descendants of enslaved families in the region have done DNA testing, hoping to find connections. But so far, nothing conclusive has emerged. There are theories. Some researchers believe Lily may have been sold to a family in Richmond and raised as a house servant. Others think she may have been resold further south to Georgia or Alabama. A few believe she may have died young, a victim of disease or neglect, her death never recorded. The truth is, we'll probably never know. Edmund Hargrove's grave is still in the family plot, on what's now private property about a mile from where the estate once stood. The plot is overgrown, the headstones tilted and weathered. His descendants, scattered across the country, have had mixed reactions to the story. Some have expressed regret for what their ancestor did. A few have reached out to historical societies and museums, offering family documents and photographs. Others have remained silent, unwilling to engage with a past they find shameful. In 2020, a descendant of Edmund Hargrove, a woman named Patricia Hargrove Chen, living in California, wrote an op-ed for a major newspaper. In it, she acknowledged what her ancestor had done and expressed her support for reparations and historical accountability. "I can't undo what Edmund Hargrove did," she wrote. "I can't bring back Lily or Ruth or any of the people he bought and sold. But I can acknowledge the truth. I can say that what he did was wrong, and I can support efforts to make amends in whatever small way possible." The op-ed sparked more debate. Some praised her for speaking out. Others criticized her, saying that acknowledgement without action was meaningless. But the conversation continued, and that perhaps is the most important thing. The fire that Ruth set burned for hours on that Christmas night in 1858, consuming not just wood and brick, but the illusion of order that men like Edmund Hargrove tried to impose on a system built on human suffering. It didn't end slavery. It didn't bring Lily back. It didn't even destroy all of Hargrove's records. Some survived, hidden in that iron box beneath the ground. But it left a mark. A scar on the land and on history that refuses to fade. In the years since the documentary was released, the story of Ruth and the Hargrove estate fire has become part of the broader conversation about slavery, resistance, and memory. It's been taught in classrooms. It's been discussed in book clubs. It's been the subject of academic papers and public lectures. And every year on Christmas Day, a small group of people gather at the marker near the road. They're descendants of enslaved families from the region, historians, activists, and others who've been moved by the story. They hold a brief ceremony, a few words, a song, a moment of silence. They leave flowers and wooden carvings. They remember. Because that's what Ruth wanted. Not revenge exactly. Not justice in the legal sense. But remembrance, a refusal to let the story be buried and forgotten. She wanted people to know that she was there. That Lily was there. That they mattered. And now, more than a century and a half later, We do know. We remember. The story of Ruth and the fire she set on Christmas night, 1858, is a story about loss and rage and the impossible choices people are forced to make in impossible circumstances. It's a story about a mother who lost her child and decided that if she couldn't have justice, she'd have retribution. It's a story about a man who valued profit over humanity and paid a price for it, though perhaps not a high enough one. But most of all, it's a story about resistance, about the ways people fight back, even when the odds are overwhelming, about the ways they refuse to be erased, even when the system is designed to erase them. Ruth couldn't save Lily. She couldn't free herself. She couldn't change the system that had enslaved her, but she could light a fire. And she did. And that fire, in its own way, is still burning. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Ruth's act was justice, or simply tragedy compounding tragedy? Was she a hero who fought back against an evil system, or a desperate woman who made a terrible choice? Leave your comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark historical mysteries like this, make sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves untold stories. There are so many more buried in the past waiting to be uncovered. See you in the next video.